Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Point Blank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday live from East London. Today we're joined by our head of school, JC Concato, to take a closer look at one of the fundamentals of mixing. So today we're going to take a closer look at EQ, which is one of the most important parts of music production. We're going to take a look at kind of different types, different applications, and some creative stuff as well. So remember, we are completely live, so get your questions in the chat box. And if you want to learn a lot more about EQ, compression, mixing in general, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. JC, welcome to Friday Forum again. How are you?
Good, Declan. Very good, and you?
Good.
Good.
Yes, it's Friday.
It's Friday.
Always in a good mood.
Absolutely.
So EQ, I mean, this is such a massive topic.
Yeah.
For loads of reasons. We're going to quickly get through it today, but
definitely.
obviously there's loads more in the courses.
There's a lot more in the courses, and I'll refer to the courses in the sense that I'm going through like kind of like one of the two lessons on both the art of mixing and mixing dance music course. We've got a whole section dedicated to EQ. Like you've said, it's such an important part. I mean, I think between pan balancing and a bit of EQing, you could mix pretty much. Everything else is kind of the icing on the cake, exactly. Isn't it?
The words of my mouth.
So EQ. I mean, what's very important first to understand before starting, and we go a lot more detail in the course, kind of science of sound. It's the fundamental of understanding how sound and how we perceive frequency and pitch. And that is a big part. And I know there's been already quite a few questions, I think, about the relation between frequency and pitch. And I think it's a big important aspect. So very briefly, the science of sound, obviously, sounds are created and it vibrates through air pressure. So when you hit a drum head or you pluck a guitar, it vibrates. When you sing, when we talk like we are doing now, our vocal cords are vibrating. That creates cycles into the air. That's being perceived as sound. Basically, the number of cycles through the air pressure is represented in hertz, and the rate per second, and that's the frequency. Now, depending on how those cycles are combined, regular cycles are perceived as musical frequency. Mm-hmm. Typically, for example, A note on a keyboard is the standard is 440 hertz.
Yeah, so it cycles 440 times in a second.
Yes, right. I believe. And we can see, for example, a lot of people are asking what's the relationship between the frequency of a pitch and the frequency and the musical pitch of a note. So I've downloaded that. You can find it. There's loads of website link that you can find. So if you look at that, it's the frequency in hertz, semitone above or below middle C. So here we've got our friend A, 440 hertz, and the middle C happened to be 261.63 hertz. So that's how notes are relating to, musical notes are relating to frequency, really. That can be useful when it comes to EQing musical part that have a definite pitch, bass lines, especially in bass line. I think we've talked about it a little bit in the sub-bass, for example, subject. But any bass lines, there are going to be time where you've got a note that's poking out or is not loud enough. And often you will see that it will be associated with that frequency lacking or poking out on your analyzer, if you look on your analyzer in Logic, for example. And that can help you to understand that relationship and bring down that note. So if for example, it's the C, middle C, that is a bit too high, you would probably need to attenuate to around 260 to 61 hertz on your EQ. So that's the kind of relationship that is important to bear in mind.
So every note has a frequency, but not every frequency is a note.
No. Right. The reason behind it is harmonics. Now, harmonics that have evenly spaced harmonics are going to be perceived as having what I would call a definite pitch. So again, if you look at those partial, the way partials are working, it's the number within a cycle, that's your cycle. And within a cycle, that's how many loop are going in. So here you've got one cycle in that time frame of, let's say, 1 second, and that could be, for example, 440, like we've said, or 60 hertz. And here you've got 2 cycles, and you see it's divided into 2. So you're getting, if it's 440, that's going to be 880. In terms of relationship with a keyboard, it's 440, it's an octave higher.
Right.
That concept is quite important to understand when it comes to, especially when you're mastering. You know, often you're going to tackle, you're thinking, oh, it's that fundamental note that resonates. And you bring it down and you're not really getting rid of the resonance. And it may be that the resonance is actually also the octave higher. That often happens in mixing or in mastering. So that's where the science of sound is quite important. We talk a lot about it in our courses in far more detail. And although you don't need to know that science to be a good engineer and EQ well, I think it helps.
Yeah, it'll help when you're troubleshooting. Mixing.
When you're troubleshooing and when you learn a little bit, I think it will help. I think understanding what you're reading on your analyzers as well and stuff like that. Now I wanted to finalize this musicality and pitch, musical frequency and pitch. Drums. You know, there's a lot of question about, do you tune your drum into the key of a song? Now, 808 typically are, have a note. And if we look at, for example, this project, let's bring some project in, I think.
Yeah, we've had Borders of the Sun, shout out to Borders of the Sun, who's watching, a regular FFL viewer who's been asking about the relationship between pitch and EQ. And
yeah. So let's illustrate that for the kick, for example. I'd like to illustrate that. Why should we tune the drums in a key? Because I think there's a lot of discussion about that I've seen. So let's bring that project. And this one happens to have an 808 kick, so it's perfect illustration. The reason behind it is that an 808 kick is close to a sine wave. The sine wave is very much a fundamental with no harmonics. Very clear, it's a pure tone, no harmonics. You hear the pitch very clearly. And when it comes to drum, that's, in my opinion, the only drum that has a clear pitch. What I would mean a very definite pitch that you can tune very carefully. So if we look at that, and let's look at our analyzer, I'm going to get rid of the EQ here. We see the notes here, boosting is roughly around, the pitch is about 50, 52. And it makes sense because you see the second here, the second boost is there, an octave higher. Yeah? So if we refer to our table here, 50 hertz, 51 roughly.
G.
Let's have a look. Let's have a look, maybe. 51 roughly, that would be F flat or G. Yeah, kind of F flat, G sharp. Good guessing. And then, well, no, it's so that gives us an idea that our bass line, for that kick to work well with our bass line, we're going to have notes in our bass line around that area.
So that can provide the fundamental, which allows us to cut out some of the more subby parts of our bass and not lose it in the overall mix.
Exactly. But then let's look at another project. Let's take, for example, let's take the same track, but this is, let's see, this one has a different kick. Do you hear a pitch as definite on that one?
Yeah, I mean, not as defined, yeah.
No, actually, personally, I don't at all. If you look at the here, you see all the harmonics, uneven in harmonics. And that example will be even more with a live kick, for example. And the more in harmonics, kind of uneven harmonics that has a sound, the less you can define the pitch. So, and it's the same for snare, in my opinion. Look at that snare here. If we look at that snare here.
Oh, is this what you want?
Look at that snare.
Yeah.
That's all your harmonics here. There's no pitch. But it doesn't mean that you can tune them. But you're going to have to go, you may define a pitch based on the strongest, the loudest harmonic in there. Yeah. And therefore, you may go with that. Or often, personally, I go with feel. What feels all right against the musical? What frequency? How do you tune it feels all right against the musical content, rather than in the key? Mm. And that's my concept of it. So that's for the musical relationship between pitch and frequency.
So you would pay attention to, when you're EQing, little boosts do refer to the key of the track in terms of frequencies.
Potentially, yeah, there are going to be frequencies that are going to be more sympathetic with the key, the musical aspect of the track, I think. That's how I'm kind of seeing it, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that when we're going to talk about assessing sound. Cool. So now it's a one-on-one EQ. Most people are aware of the type of filters you have on an EQ, but very quickly, I think we may as well define it by bringing that in.
Is this what you want? Will things ever change?
So you've got your typical, your high pass or low cut filters at each extremity. Very useful for corrective EQ, and we'll go into the approaches and stuff, but that is the first one to go. And typically with analog, when we use, back in the days of analog, there's a lot of electronics involved. The more electronic involved, the less pure the sound becomes. The more it's starting to change things, and we can talk about it, phase shift and all that kind of thing that happen within EQ. So by nature, we tend to use the less you do in the analog world in terms of EQ, the better. So if you can only do one filter, which is effectively one knob on the desk, or one parameter here, I mean, I know those ones have more because you can choose the slope and the Q. They're digital EQ, they have more parameters. But the old ways, old school desk would have literally one filter. I can illustrate that. Let's bring, for example, an SSL EQ. So I've got an SSL EQ somewhere there. A G channel, for example. Here it is. You see here, that's my filters. It's one knob. Yeah. So we tend to go with that first. If you can only get away with a filter, you would do the filter, and that will be that. Less electronic involved, keeping the sound more pure. And I think I apply the same technique in the digital world, because in the digital world, remember, the more you do, and I see people over EQing and putting 10 EQ or 3 EQ, lots of different bands, and you really should think about, is that the best? Is it the most? Take the shortcut. Is it the shorter route to get the sound I want? Because the more you do, the more you deteriorate the sound. So my concept is less is more in EQ. And I think in everything, I think every engineer would, if you look at like last week, FFL with Justin, you look at the EQ practice, there's only a couple of things, do as little as you can. You'll keep a better. So those are your, may as well switch that off. You've got the filter, then you've got your bell or peak filter. Those are here. And the reason they're peak or bell is because you can do that. So let's go there. And you see here. What it means is you're literally picking a frequency, boosting it, and it's only boosting that frequency and frequency around depending on the type it is, whether it's a semi-parametric or a parametric. Here it's a parametric, so you can really define how much you're changing the frequency around the frequency you've changed. Right. They are more precise. They can be used for boosting, for cutting, for notching, all those type of different frequencies, really, really for the kind of detailed work where you need to get into the resonance, specific harmonics. We've talked about harmonics before. That's where it comes into the picture. And then you've got your shelves. Shelves are like, think of it as your hi-fi system. Yeah. Often have a shelf. So what happened with the shelf, as a quick summary, you all know how they work, I would imagine. I'm boosting here 10K. In reality, what happened is that it's boosting after as well. And normally a flat shelving would be something like that. So where I'm boosting, everything else is equally after that, depending on the type of the shape and the curve. And etc. So those are mostly the filters. Between the peak, if you use a peak like that, so let me illustrate with that, for example, here. If I'm going to do a massive boost to show. What we call notch filters, occasionally, are very narrow. Yeah. And they're very useful. I don't boost with that. It's a bit unnatural, but very useful to get rid of a very specific frequency. So that's your filter. And then you've got, after that, your type, so many different type of EQ. Yeah. And I think the best is to start going in through practices, and that way we can illustrate. But really quickly to clarify, you've got your fixed band, your parametric. Fixed band, it's clear, it's a fixed band EQ, you don't choose, that's your EQ. It's based on, and you're boosting that or attenuating at that particular frequency. And then you've got the EQ design, and it's it's only valid for analog circuits. You know, we hear of discrete, of class A, you know, class A, B, which, by the way, class A doesn't mean that it's better than class AB, it's just a different type. Class A would be an EVE 1073. They tend to be warm, red-rounded, fat, really pleasant. Class AB design are like, for example, I think the 1081 Neve, or the API 550, which I know you like very much.
Yes, I do.
They tend to be a little bit more, not harsh, but they are a little bit more in your face, but there's a place for it, completely. All valve EQ, for example, tend to use class A. And you've got all those different type of EQ, you know. Those are for the design. And luckily now in the world of digital simulation, we have access to all those plugins that emulate those very expensive gear that only big mix studio would have. So we've got the emulation, I've got the UAD here, I've got the waves and the plugin alliance, the Mac 4 EQ, which is a great EQ as well, but it's a fixed EQ, for example. And we will look into that. You know, there's no point going into much detail into that kind of stuff. Just something about EQ quickly as well. Musical bands, we talk a lot about musical band, and I've seen a question, musicality of EQ. And often there's this misconception that it's because the EQ has chosen the frequency right. And I think personally, I don't think it's so much the frequency, it's the curve. Right. The curve is everything. You know, we've seen here, for example, let me illustrate again. If I do a shelving here, you see it has a special curve, and Logic EQ, I can change my curve. And I think that is also as important, what defines the quality of an EQ.
So in like
being
classic
more pleasing.
EQs, instead of it being the fixed band they've chosen being the happens to be the right musical frequency, it's actually the way in which it's boosted.
The way the curve, you know, that curve where it is boosting what it's doing before. It's a combination of both, I think. But really the curve is a really, really big part of EQ, I think. Yeah. And we can talk a little bit about the Q couple here in Logic. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. People are not always aware of it. It's a new thing that you have in Logic now. Before that, it used to be under the extra parameters, but now you've got it here. Yeah. And that is to simulate how analog EQ tend to work, which basically, to show you, to demonstrate actually, let's do that. Let's not use that one because I've already done something with that one. Let's use that one. And I'm going to boost that. And if I'm putting the Q, by default, are you noticing I'm going to do that? It's getting narrower as I'm boosting. And it's even more so here. Look at that. It's becoming narrower. It's wider and it's becoming narrower. Typically, a lot of analog EQ have that kind of curve, particular characteristic. Yeah. The more you boost or cut, the narrower automatically the Q becomes. If you take that off, then it doesn't change. It's quite important to be aware of that because, again, it's really much part of the musicality of your EQ. Yeah. So something important to be aware of, in my opinion. Cool.
Shall we dive in?
Shall we dive in indeed? So obviously when you choose your EQ, you're going to take into context what I've just said about those characteristics, you know. And from experience as an engineer, you tend to learn that, yeah, the 1073 is going to be a bit more pleasing. The Pultec is going to be more pleasing. We love those top end. The Mag EQ has a lovely top end as well. You know, it's called airband EQ. It's known for that. Lovely on vocal, lovely on mix buses, you know. I have it on my mix bus most of the time, for example, you know. So, and if you want something more in your face, you know, SSL EQ is great for rock, hip hop, and that R&B, for example, because it's slightly more in your face. So you're going to start making those decisions when it comes kind of like, which EQ should I use? You know, learn the sound of your EQ, and then you'll be able to apply them when you need them. Cool. So there are three ways to approach EQ, I think, in general. Corrective, and it's to compensate for the shortcomings of a recording, microphone, room, whatever. Tone shaping, creative. It's really similar to corrective in a way, you know, because your tone shaping, you correct as well, effectively. Let me illustrate that, for example. Let's start with corrective. Shall we start with corrective? And there's a lot of corrective EQ that you do. And typically, I tend to do my corrective EQ before the compressor. I know a lot of people ask before, after. I tend to do my very corrective to correct big problems. that no matter what I'm going to do in my mix, no matter how it's going to fit in my mix, you need to correct. There's a problem with the sound. Typically here, have a look here. This sound, it's that white noise sound. I get that. I mean, it's going way above 20k apart here. So one thing you want to do here is, for example, correcting the harshness. How do you correct harshness? Filter, very useful, obviously, straight away. And I would bring my filter quite down on that one. I don't want to go 20k. Straight away it helps. But again, you're still getting a boost here. And also you're getting all that low energy. I know we're not hearing it so much. It's quite a low. But if you want that kind of clear bottom end to fit into your track, I think you need to clean it as well. So let's clean that as well. And then you're going to choose how far you go with it. Given the nature of this sound, you really don't need to hear all that low mid. So you can really, really go up. That means everything else that's going to fit in your mix is going to work better here as well. So that's my corrective EQ done. Then I could shape it a little bit as well. I find that here around 15k roughly, 14, she's still a bit more. It's still a bit too much. Now I could bring my filter down, but a more natural way to do it could be also, that's where a shelf could come into its own. So let's bring a shelf around here. And instead of removing it entirely, a shelf allows you to attenuate rather than remove completely. So, and it's quite a nice musical way to do it. So you see, and we can bring down the shelf here a little bit. A bit dull. And that's the difference now that we're having. Have a look. Now that peak is, and we've kind of flattened it out a little bit. Let's see how it fits in our mix now. That's harsh. It fits much better. Okay? So I've done my corrective EQ and kind of shaping on this part, for example. But there's another part about mixing, which is separation in the mix. Which is really, every time you bring an element into a mix, it's about how it fits into with the other. And in my opinion, the more elements you have, the kind of smaller you're going to have to make them, because there's so much space that you're fighting. And we can go into that kick bass, and we're going to do into all those different. But typically, so yeah, we'll go here. So we could start doing that separation together, for example, on the bass, two basses together. So let's look at two basses together. We've got those two bass here. We've got a bass here. I mean, I've already EQ'd it, but there's a lot of bottom end. And you could say, well, you've made it really thin. Why? It's because it also happens to have a sub-bass sound that does the bottom end for you. So if I'm going to leave, what I'm getting is the low end is actually phasing now. You see now? And you notice that they're more bass, there's less now, because both the low end, the sub, are fighting each other. Therefore, they're phasing. So what we're doing here with EQ is effectively, now the sub bass is coming through better, because basically you're doing separation where every sounds are a mix and a wide range of frequency. So when they are in the same spectrum, one has to leave space for another.
Yeah, is that one of the caveats of EQing in solo? Is that you won't get that picture?
Exactly, because if I had EQ'd in solo that sound, I probably would have left some of that. Yeah, you know, I probably would. Yeah. You know, it sounds better, so I would have done that. But then I would have. You bring that. Because now I can do that and bring the solo. It's cleaner. They both have their function.
Yeah.
So, the three approach we have, it's basically corrective, tone shaping. Tone shaping is more about making your sound more beautiful or more ugly. Yeah. You've got your sound and you've spent a lot of time shaping it, whether it's electronically or with a mic. And then it's still not quite right. You want to make it more beautiful. And that's where lovely EQs like a 1073 or that have a nice top end or a mag EQ. So to illustrate that, what we could do, Shall we bring, we had this session a long time ago, the drum and bass, yeah. Because those vocals have a problem. So I think we need to look at those vocals to assess them.
Yours. If
Yeah,
we
and Manchester
just
Music UK is
make
actually asking, are there
a
any frequencies you should pay attention to when you're EQing a vocal? I know that obviously, and he's pointed out as well, it depends on the singer.
It depends, of
microphone,
course, no,
but-
he's right. But I mean, basically, they are kind of, in the course we go in more detail. But I'll give you some.
Okay. Little teaser.
Well, I'll give you a little teaser. So I've got my notes, you know, I had to. So typically on a female vocal, the bass is going to be around 100
Yeah,
hertz.
So the fundamentals.
Yeah, up to, you know, 2K. But the warmth and body is going to be about 200, 500 hertz, in that range. The boxiness is going to be at 500, 700. So if it's a bit boxy, or if you need to cut here, that's where it's going to happen.
Yeah.
The kind of sound articulation, 1K, 2K. But the presence is going to be more 2 to 5K. And then the sibilant is going to be around 5 to 7K. And the top is going to be at 7K upwards.
Okay.
That's for a female voice, roughly a frequency guide. Each instrument have their frequency guide. On the kick drum, a kick drum will be probably 80 hertz, and below will be the sub. Above that, you will get the kind of weight and punch at 80, 120, etc., etc.
Yeah.
You know, and in the course we go in a lot of details about that. But here I'm going to look at what I've done with this vocal and apply what we've talked about really. So have a look. How do you approach assessing your vocal? Assessing audio in general and EQing? You know, you need to assess. And a lot of people are saying, well, you know, I don't know what to listen to. And to be honest, I think you should assess your vocal the same way you assess music. Why do you prefer a bass line than another? And it's the same with music, with EQing. You should assess what I don't like about the sound, what I like about the sound. So what I don't like about the sound is where you're going to cut. What I like about the sound is maybe what you're going to bring up. And then what I want to do with these sounds, what I want that sound to sound like in the mix, you know, and what I want this to sound like, so it may be the creative, the tone shaping, and then where should I place this sound within the mix? That's your mix separation.
Yeah.
That's how I kind of assess my audio, okay? And also reference for me is very important, especially when you start learning, when you don't know the room, when you don't know the speaker. Because when you start a mix, if your drums are a bit dull and you don't do something about it, then the rest of the mix will be dull because you bring everything into the context. That's where I tend to reference extremely early when I start mixing.
You've been referencing the track.
Yeah.
You want to sound like.
Yeah,
Okay.
and be aware that obviously tracks are going to be mastered if you reference from a CD, so bear that in mind. They will be brighter, overly bright, more bright than what you're working on, which is pre-mastered. But it's a good reference to use, you know, aim for the best. Yeah. So I reference very early, and after that I can forget about it, because I've got my spectrum, I understand where should be my low, my mid, and my top. Yeah? So let's look at this vocal, for example, to kind of do a little bit what we've talked here. Straight away, you've got this here, problematic, yeah? Between 50 hertz, it's gonna get in the way. So as a creative, as a corrective approach, I'm gonna get rid of that straight away. You could even go higher if you wanted.
If we just make a way.
Okay? And then we've got this resonance here.
Let them talk.
So how do you find your resonance? Obviously, when you've got a spectrum analyzer, you kind of see them. But I would encourage people not to use a spectrum analyzer. You know, I love old EQ where you don't see and you go with here. So how do you go about, what are the steps to find the offending frequency or the pleasing frequency? So let's go with that. Typically, you're going to have a fairly narrow Q, boost by about 10 dB, 15 dB, that should do the trick, and then you sweep. You see the boxiness?
If we just make a way.
You see the resonance? Yeah. Here, you don't hear.
And let them talk.
This one is really the problematic one, isn't it? So we bring it down. And then I'm going to go after that. You decide how much with your cue.
Just make a way.
How much should you EQ the fundamental? Because part of me has some kind of bizarre rule where I feel like I shouldn't really be cutting the fundamental too much because the overall sound will become thinner.
It would, yeah, definitely.
But it'll only become thinner in solo. Because
In
of maybe
solo.
something,
So again, you know, try not to mix to EQ in solo too much when you start building, when you bring sounds. First, well, at least when you assess, and then when you need to do corrective, yes, you need to bring in solo to hear better what you're doing, and then bring it back into the context. So we're going to do that way in solo, and then
if we just make a way and let them
this frequency is really bad, you know, and that's probably the shortcoming of the room. So I'm doing, that's what I mean by I'm doing correct, I'm doing both corrective and tone shaping here in a way. So that's what I mean, they're quite close to each other. So we've got that, and I'm doing it with logic to illustrate to you guys, so we can view what we're doing here. But if we go with also, so have you noticed that if I bypass here, the vocal sounds dull, okay? But the reason it sounds dull, it's all about masking, isn't it? Masking meaning a frequency hiding the content of other frequency. By removing those low resonance, now it sounds already brighter.
Yeah. So you haven't made it brighter by boosting any high frequencies?
No.
That's a real fundamental, excuse the point to understand that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And someone's asked that, actually, it was Ocular who asked what's the difference between boosting and lowering, and if you boost all over 8,000 or cut all below 8,000, what would be the difference in the...
It's not that straightforward because it's not 8,000 below and above.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's a sound is a complex waveform. If you look at this, it's not only... So it's about rebalancing, bringing a tonal that is pleasing.
Yeah.
That's what it's about, really. But by default, boosting is less pleasing to the ear with EQ. It brings a lot of harmonic distortion. EQ are better at, in terms of preserving the quality of the sound, you do a better job by as cutting rather than boosting. Right. It's kind of an essential rule when it comes to mix, and in general with EQ. Unless, obviously, you go creative and you want the sound to be a bit ugly and in your face. And also, there are EQ that are known to be pleasing. And let's look at some of them, maybe, shall we? So, we've talked about our 1073, one of the king of the EQ, the Pultec, the legendary Pultec, the Mag EQ, Top Air. So all those are famous to have a warm sound, and especially, in particular, a really pleasing top end. You know, that kind of 10K, 12K. So let's see what it does on our vocal. Instead of doing it with that, I'm not going to boost with that EQ. I'm going to boost, bring a bit of air. I mean, we've rebalanced the vocal, it's better now, but it's still lacking a bit of air, I think. Let's have a listen in the context of the track. Still could have a little bit more air sparkle. You know, because if you, in the context, if you put in the context of the snare is quite sizzly. So suddenly it makes the vocal, again, that's what we were saying. You start with the dull drums, your whole mix is going to be dull. Here, the drums and everything is quite exciting. The music is really, you know, there. So the vocal, it kind of like it doesn't seem to belong.
It's a bit nutchy.
Yeah, it doesn't feel to belong in the same world, doesn't it? So let's compare. Let's bring, for example, go on. Let's do the Neve. Where is it gonna be though? Where is the Neve on this one? Is it gonna be on the 1073 or? It's really hard to see at that resolution, I have to say. Plus, maybe my view is going a bit. Neve, 1073. Oh, this one is not the right. We've got the Legacy. So let's put the other one. Sorry about that. The list is so long of those UAD.
Too many plugins.
We don't have them all. That's the thing. So when you end up when you end up having the,
you need to take advantage of that new Logic feature that allows you to categorize by EQ compressors. Yeah.
Indeed.
That's your
So-
weekend sorted.
yeah, probably. You're right. So here you've got the Neve, typical. You can boost it here, and then you see we've talked about fixed and parametric and stuff. Really hard to see anything on here. Really. That's your bottom end here, and that's your top end. The Neve has a fixed band, 12K.
Right.
For the top end. It's fixed, it's 12K. There's not even a curve, it's a shelf. You can't do much about it.
If we just make a way.
So bring that kind of.
Yeah, I mean, you can go pretty hard with it. It still sounds
It's so musical.
Yeah.
You know, that's the thing you will notice about different EQs. The more musical they are, probably the more you can bring that up, you know. So here it's a nice top end. But
If we just make a way.
it's still, for me, it's still missing a bit of a presence. And what we could do, another EQ I'm a big fan of, is the Plugin Alliance, the mag. It's really, again, fixed band. And the 2.5 is a shelving, interestingly. All the other ones are peaks, even the sub. And I remember we talked about it, the sub is actually 10 hertz.
10.
Yeah, and the low here is 40. Yeah, 160, 650, and 2.5. But it's a shelf. So let's see what the shelf at 2.5 does. That means
Yours.
it's becoming too much.
If we just make a way.
Let's bring that in the context.
And let them talk.
It's already better.
What would our say?
See, so that's how you would kind of approach, for example. We've done here a mixture of corrective, tone shaping, and fitting in the mix as well.
Yeah. Cool.
Are there any questions, or do you want me to carry on?
We have
I've got lots of examples
A
that I
lot
can
of
go through.
questions. If there's anything more to look at, we'll look at it now before we dive into questions. If you've got
Okay.
anything to show.
Okay. So.
So yeah, last shout out for questions, guys. Get them in now if you want to.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
awesome.
again, let's look at. There's something I wanted to talk about quickly. Is about more the kind of really nasty specific harmonics.
Yeah.
How to get rid of really nasty harmonics.
I mean, it's funny because in electronic music, a lot of the stuff you won't have, it wasn't recorded in the room, so the room and the microphone won't actually affect the sound that much.
No.
I think a lot of corrective EQ for a lot of electronic music producers is more about tone shaping.
It's
Just
yeah.
shaping samples.
And
to make
again,
work.
it falls under kind of making it work in the mix as well. You know, if we, a lot of the cut, low cut, it's to leave the bass. In electronic music, the bass is so important. So for example, here, we've got really nasty harmonics on this synth. And I'm going to use the Logic EQ because look at those harmonics.
Yeah, it's that really sensitive area as well of 1 to 2K.
And obviously here, that's so, you see, the reason they're so distinctive is, you see, there's nothing in between at all. You need to do something on those. So clearly, let's face it. And there's lots of them. So it's one of them. This one is the first one to go for, yeah, clearly. This one as well. And then this one as well. Ooh. So you see here, it's already a lot more pleasant, isn't it? I think we could go more. And here it's still a bit harsh, so we could go with a shelf. And straight away it's better. So you're tackling harmonies. that kind of like.
Yeah, and
I mean,
that allows you to actually bring it up in the mix.
Yeah.
As well. To make the
Exactly.
actual sound
Exactly.
louder without bringing up the unpleasantries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one more example I want to show of what you can do a mistake in isolation and what happened between a mix and a bass. So I've got two examples actually of the same track, and it was a track produced by Paul Weller, great producer, and he's done that for what used to be our hip hop course.
Okay.
There's a couple of versions. There's the original version which is there. The lovely kind of track request, laid back. And if you listen to the drums on their own, the kick sounds really nice. But there's a bit of a resonance here, and with the bass is quite low. So, what we need to do. So you see the bass is around that kind of 50 hertz area. We may have a problem at some stage in terms of getting them to sit together. What I've done is by cutting a little bit of the 50 here, where the bass is happening, there's less of a clash now. They don't work as well. Now they work much better in the context of the track.
Even a lancer, never thought she had kissing it on a Cupid prancer. Used to have a dancer's body.
And the kick may be not as fat as we want it to, but it's because if you want that fat bass, you can't have them both in the same area. So again, I think it's a good illustration of
And making a mixed decision and just sticking to it.
yeah, rather than in solo.
Yeah.
Any other question?
We've got loads of questions. Smillion Beats is asking if we have a distorted recording, is there any way to fix it with
No.
EQ?
Well,
No,
I mean, if
next.
it's yeah, no. I mean, especially if it's digital distortion, I would suggest the best way is to make a feature of it.
Yeah.
And distort it even more.
Yeah.
And then you make a feature of it.
Yeah. But then also distortion adds harmonics, so it might be worth doing some notch EQs to take out the harmonics. It won't.
It could.
Save
If it's a
the
digital,
original
if it's a
sound,
digital at a very specific point, you could. But otherwise, I would distort.
Yeah.
Therefore, it
To
would
make
be
it
masked.
worse.
It would be masked. You know, it's all about masking. You know,
Yeah.
this whole concept of masking is really important in EQ.
Manchester Music UK is asking, how would you know which EQs are better for softer stuff and which are better for harder stuff, I guess?
Well, again, it goes back into the style where the design of EQ. You know, the SSL 5K, for example, is really great on snares and things for rock, for R&B. Most hip-hop records are mixed on SSL because of that. It has that kind of in-your-face sound, same with R&B. Hip-hop and R&B, but for rock stuff, sometimes if you want that kind of slightly softer, richer, warmer sound, people tend to go with Neve.
Yeah.
And depend on the kind of rock, depend on the mix engineer choice as well. So I think it comes from like I've said, it comes from the design, the curves, the musicality of it.
Yeah.
You know, if a sound is a bit harsh and I want to soften it, I'm going to use a 1073, maybe with an LA2A compressor.
And
both of them
I
are
guess
soft.
You've come to those conclusions through trial and error by using the equipment, so I guess
From
the key is to experiment.
To experiment, which is why it goes against don't have too many plugins. You know, you said I had many, but actually don't. I've got few plugin alliance. I've got the waves, you know, and the UAD, but I don't even have all of them in each category. Effectively, it's the 1073, the Pultec, the SSL, API, that is and the Mag EQ. That is my kind of bread and butter EQ really, and the Logic one for surgical.
Yeah, cool. NXCDX is wondering, is sidechain the bass so it ducks when the kick hits the same? Is it the same as cutting the low end of the bass so it doesn't interfere with the kick?
No, it's not the same because what you're doing, your compressor is not an EQ.
Yeah.
You could as well maybe use dynamic EQ, that's something else. Again, I tend to try to go with the simplest methods. A tight chaining, you're only doing when it's happening.
Yeah.
So it's not static, it's dynamic.
But it can be more natural that way.
But it can be more natural, exactly. Whereas with the bass, cutting with an EQ can be static. It's all the time it's been cut out. So something to think about.
Yeah. Let's find some more questions. Steve Ebenezer Paul's asking, do you prefer sub-bass in the lowest end of the frequency and bass above that, or vice versa? I guess sub-kick bass lines.
You mean sub-bass against kick?
Yeah.
It depends on the sound of the track, and also how well it is. You know, if a kick has if the bass hasn't got such a nice bottom end, so I'm not going to fight against it and try to make it happen. But the kick has, I'm going to go with what. But it's really more. It's a decisive, creative decision when you mix, really.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. I've got no rule. It's a creative decision when you mix. You make a choice of. I think on that track it should be the kick dominating the low end, or vice versa. Also, it means on smaller speaker. You know that the sub is not going to come through on smaller speakers like the laptops. So you've got to be aware of that. Is it the kick that you want people to hear on small speakers, or is it the bass?
Yeah. Manchester Music UK again is asking, what EQ tips, I think this is going to be a common question, do you have to get a more higher, crisper quality track? I guess this is more towards mastering end of things, but...
Yeah, but I mean, basically, one thing I do now more and more, all the time actually, is have an EQ on my bus before even I start EQing everything. Typically, the mic EQ is often the one I go for. Because it has that air bend that is just really so lovely, really, that kind of back-sendal.
So you mix into an EQ that has a high boost?
Yeah, that means I EQ less on every single channel as well. By doing that, you've got a massive, you've got a more natural sound, in my opinion, rather than boost. You know, think of it, instead of boosting 10 channels by 3 dB, you may boost them by 2 or 1.5 and boost the master channel. Therefore, the overall, you're getting less of those distortion, harmonic distortion that comes with boosting in EQ.
Yeah, it's good too.
But also make sure, you know, the mud, get rid of the mud. Get rid of the, you know, make sure that the bottom end is clear, and get rid of everything that is muddy is going to make your track less bright and crispy.
So like we heard in the vocal, instead of jumping straight to bring up the highs because it isn't bright enough, look at the muddy problem.
And see if that gives you what you want.
Yeah, because it might not.
Yeah, exactly.
Zombified86 asking, are certain EQs better for mastering than others?
Yeah.
So would fixed band be better?
It really depends. I mean, I can touch something very quickly, is that EQs introduce a phase shift between each band. Every time there's a new band, there's a small delay, it's a phase shift. Therefore, harmonic distortion, etc., etc. Less natural sound. So typically in mastering engineers tend to want to use linear phase EQ. That's where it comes in. That's why you're getting this delay compensation. Yeah? Can we do have time to demonstrate something interesting or not? If we don't, please.
We have 1 minute. The countdown begins. No pressure.
I can't work under those conditions. Here is a mix. So I'm going to put something to be aware in Logic. Is the channel EQ, you can swap it with the linear phase EQ and it will keep your settings.
Right. Oh, that's handy.
That on my master. It helps. Yeah? Now, what you can do is, I think generally, to cut, the channel EQ is more effective, but to boost is not always as pleasing than the linear phase. So that's what I've done this example. So what you can do here is change it with the linear phase instead. And have a look now. There. It has kept the settings, different color, but in my opinion it's more pleasing.
Yeah.
More subtle.
Noticeably different.
Yeah, I mean, I want to illustrate that. I've boost clear, you know, I went over the top with the boost on the top end, but I wanted you to hear that.
Yeah.
It is less phase shift, it's more subtle. So mastering EQ, I tend to be more subtle. I mean, I love also the Brainworks V2, for example, for that reason. It's a lot more subtle. I don't tend to use it so much on an individual element, but for the mastering, you want to be subtle.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, we are out of time now, unfortunately, but there's loads more of those types of examples on the course. Art of Mixing here in London and Mixing Dance Music online.
Yes, and the art of mixing on the HE as well online.
On the HE, of course.
So there's,
yes.
yeah, there's
So yeah, hopefully you got plenty of inspiration for the weekend. And if you're still thirsty for more, come and check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. And we'll be back next weekend for another Friday Forum Live. We'll see you then. Cheers.